Good evening and welcome. I'm pleased to welcome UVA alumni, friends, and families to today's webinars. If you want to submit questions to our panelists during the webinar, you may use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Our panelist, Renee, will try to answer as many questions as time allows after the main discussion. At this time, I'd like to invite our speaker, Renée Cummings, to turn on her camera for introductions. Renee is the Assistant Professor of Practice. She's a member of the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council on Data Equity and an active speaker on the national and international stages for her work on ethical AI and technologies. In the last year, she has been a featured speaker around the world, ranging from a presentation to the North Carolina high school students to a roundtable discussion on AI-focused legislation at the European Union Parliament in Brussels. Cummings has even made a television appearances offering expert analysis in criminology and criminal psychology on iCrimes with Elizabeth Vargas, and has been named to several best of lists, including the top 5 innovators in AI named by World Summit AI and 50 influential women named by InspiredMinds. It is my pleasure to welcome Renée Cummings to our webinar. Renée, you can take it away.
Thank you so very much for that introduction, Kate. And let me say it is always an honor and a pleasure to have events such as these where I get to share some of the things that are keeping me up at night or exciting me, and just to really engage with our alum and just the general public. So I'm going to share my screen here for a second. Let me just get this up, and you will tell me if it's coming up. Are you seeing it?
It looks great. Yeah, we just need to make it big.
And I'm going to try to make it big. Is it big?
It is big. It's great to go.
Fantastic. So I'm going to just call this a conversation that we're going to have. It is about 6 p.m. Don't know where in the world you are, but just a conversation to take us into dinner. And this conversation looks at the ways in which we need to reimagine AI ethics through data activism. So we begin with this. There is no AI without data. Data is the lifeblood of artificial intelligence. When we think about data, we're thinking about this extraordinary promise, this thing often that we cannot see, that has the ability to transform just about every methodology, as we are seeing it transforming just about every discipline, every industry, just everything about the ways in which we are interacting, engaging, building, innovating, creating. Data has this extraordinary promise. And this is the promise on which AI is built, because data has the ability to solve some of the world's greatest questions. Well, what we're also seeing with data is that as it is solving these questions, data is also opening up some very deep wounds. So when we think about data, we're talking about this promise, we're talking about the power, and what this power and promise, when it comes together, what they do is they create these extraordinary possibilities. So now with data and the lifeblood of AI, what we're seeing is just this imagination that's being stretched, and data is being used for us to just reimagine just about everything that we're doing and creating these extraordinary possibilities as we continue to see in everything. When we think about healthcare, when we think about education, when we think about architecture, when we think about art, when we think about media, think about it. And data and AI is just stretching the imagination of it and really expanding the possibilities. And now that we're doing all of this, what we're seeing is extraordinary progress. We have progressed so much. If we want to take that progress from, let's say, COVID to where we are now, we have seen how many institutions have had to rethink their business model. We have seen how many individuals have created, have innovated, have done really extraordinary things using data and using AI. But what we've also realized is that this power creates this extraordinary privilege. And where there is privilege, there is the potential for prejudice. And when you're dealing with people, because that is what data is about. data is about people. We're seeing that what we've got to put in place are these guardrails, because the power of data also means that we've got to protect people because of the kinds of privilege that we're seeing that are creating these prejudices, what we call the bias and the discrimination that we continue to see in data and, of course, AI. So what is data about? Data is really about decision making. That's what we do with data. We want to make the best decisions. We want to make the most accurate decisions. You may have heard about precision decision making. Precision healthcare is the big one. We want to use data to make very intelligent decisions. Data is about intelligent public measurement. When we think about data and public policy, when we think about data and governance, when we think about just every aspect of data. So if we are making decisions, we want to ensure that the data that we are using is the most accurate data, quality data, because we want to make the best decision. So what is this big promise about big data? And for me, it's these four things. When we think about data, and when we think about these extraordinary possibilities, those possibilities are built on these four foundations. Hindsight. With data, we get an opportunity to learn from the past. We also get an opportunity to predict and prepare for the future. That's foresight. We also have the opportunity of insight, which is we have the ability to interpret the things that we are seeing and come up with the right kinds of responses, the requisite types of interventions. And of course, there's oversight, ways in which we need to mitigate and to monitor and to manage. So when we're talking decision making, we're talking about the promise of hindsight, foresight, insight, and of course, oversight. But this is what we're seeing, and this is where it starts to get a little complicated. Much of the data sets that we're using to make these data-driven decision-making, or what we may call algorithmic decision-making, or what we may call automated decision-making, we're realizing that there are some challenges there. We're seeing an unevenness, and we're seeing inequalities. We're seeing racial disparities, economic disparities. We're seeing data that is marginalizing. We're seeing systemic racism, and we're asking ourselves, where is it coming from? Why is it that these systems that we are building, these socio-technical systems that we are building, why are they so vulnerable to these kinds of inequalities? And it comes down to this: historical data sets. Now, we are not perfect. The world is not perfect. So if we've been historically collecting data, of course, we are going to collect data that reflects who we are. So the data sets are definitely going to be as perfect as we are, which means probably imperfect. But historical data harms are very critical to understanding data activism and understanding why data activism is being used to reimagine AI ethics. What we have seen with these historical data harms is that our history, the past, the good things and the not so good things, have all found their way into our data sets. And it is the historical data that we are using to build our AI systems, our new and emerging technology that's exciting the world, are finding themselves in a very precarious place, because what we have seen is that these historical data sets, baked into them, we are seeing the bias, we are seeing the discrimination, and we are realizing that many of our data sets carry with them a history and a memory. And trapped in the memory of these data sets are some very traumatic experiences that replicate themselves as historic harms, past prejudices, some of them deeply destructive. And what we are also seeing in the ways in which we are building many of our AI systems and the ways in which we are using these historical data sets, that we continue, consciously and unconsciously, to codify bias and discrimination and really to automate the status quo. This is something very interesting, and I decided to just throw it out here very early. 3 women who really drilled deep into these historical data sets. One is Dr. Joy Bulamwini, the other is Dr. Timnit Gebru, and the other is Deborah Raji. And they came up with a pretty brilliant paper called Gender Shades. And in that paper, this is what was revealed. And the actual name, pale male bias, is attributed to Dr. Joy Buolamwini. She has a great new book that's coming out called Unmasking AI, and she really presents herself not only as a scientist, but as a poet of code. And she says that what is considered the pale male bias is really this. And what it is, it can be very dysfunctional for Black and Brown people, and of course, dark-skinned individuals. Up to 77.4 subjects in mainstream data sets are male, and up to 94.6 are lighter skinned male. So we're thinking historic data, we're thinking pale male bias, and that brings us into this space called the politics of big data. And you've probably heard data is about control, data is about monetization. Where there's monetization, there's an easy space for monopolization. And where there's monopolization and monetization, you know that things like oppression and exploitation and weaponization are real. So while data has this extraordinary ability to do these brilliant, amazing, and transformative things, what we're also seeing with data is that data also has the ability to do some very dangerous things. And between the extraordinary and between the dangerous is where a lot of this politics happens. So the big question is, how do we close the gap between data's computational meaning and data's cultural meaning? Because we're realizing that the computational is not often what is seen culturally. And this is where data activism comes in. And data activism is about using data to challenge the status quo and to advocate for change. And about 2 years ago, if not 3, I really had the honor, the pleasure, and of course still the privilege to be the data activist in residence at the School of Data Science. And that opportunity gave me the ability to really stand firm and stand tall in this space called data activism, because I felt that there needed to be this greater level of accountability and equity. And that's what data activism is about. It's about bringing greater equity and accountability and transparency to decision making. Earlier, I spoke about data as being an accurate measurement, as being a public measurement of data as being about business intelligence. So what data activism is about, it's really about advocating for equity. And if we're advocating for equity, you know you're advocating for justice as well. But equity is also about accountability. And it's about transparency. It's about diversity. It's about inclusion. And data activism is also about empowering individuals to empower themselves and to empower their communities and to lift up civil society so that they can advocate for not only their community interests, but for all our interests. So data activism is about digital rights. It's about algorithmic justice. It's about thinking of data and thinking of digitization and thinking of algorithms within the context of justice and civil rights and human rights. It's also about raising public awareness and enhancing public information. It's also about public interest technology by the people and for the people, and ensuring that it is inspired by the needs and driven by the imagination of the community. Data activism is about all of this coming together to advance economic, political, and social change. It's about making data more accessible, understandable, usable. It's about people understanding the power of their data and understanding what they can do with that power, and people seeing themselves not only as consumers of these products, but seeing themselves as producers of knowledge, producers of the data that's being used. And it's about equity, it's about accountability, it's about transparency. And I just want to repeat those. That's why I put them here again, because these are the things that are very critical, because these things are about trust. It's about public trust, and it's about public confidence when we think about technology, new and emerging technologies such as AI or generative AI. And social justice is critical. It is critical to the design, development, and deployment of technology. Something I want you to think about. We spoke about these historic data sets. And when we think about this history and this memory that data carries with it and the trauma what we have seen is that in many communities, in particular, Black and Brown communities, particular communities that are operating at a particular socioeconomic level, underserved, high needs communities. And this is not just about Black and Brown, but we also include here people who are poor, white people who are poor. So oftentimes when we think about bias and discrimination, we always think Black and Brown, but we've got to think wider than that, because there are many people who are impacted by these technologies. So data trauma, and this is an image from the Tuskegee syphilis study, which really, unfortunately, represents one of the most traumatic experiences in the history of this country when we think about the collection of healthcare data. And when we think about data at the moment, we are thinking about algorithms. And many individuals have been reporting very traumatic experiences with algorithms, with AI, with data. Some of them have been wrongfully arrested. Some of them have been denied loans. Some of them have been denied scholarships. Some of them have been denied access to housing, access to healthcare. Some of them have had their children taken away from them because of algorithms. So trauma is really what happens to you and what happens inside you when a certain decision is made about you in particular, when an algorithm makes a decision about you. And you may not know, or you may know, that algorithms are making decisions about us daily. And when an algorithm or anything has the ability, or anyone has the ability to make a decision about you without you knowing and without you participating or without giving you an explanation, that decision, that process has undermined questions of agency, questions of autonomy, questions of self-determination. And these are the things on which we build our identity. So there's a big, big question there when we think about data and algorithms creating trauma. What we've also seen is that different communities have historically experienced data differently. And one of the things that I always say is that data do not have the luxury of historical amnesia. Data cannot forget. No matter how we may want our data to forget, it just cannot forget. So past decisions are trapped in the memory of many of our data sets. And what we are seeing is that while data has the ability to resolve some of these extraordinary questions that we've been asking ourselves from time immemorial, what we're also seeing is that these big social wounds are being opened: bias and discrimination and toxic sorts of patterns that we are seeing online with hate and extremism and harassment. And data suffused with cultural meaning, independent, I said it before, independent of its computational meaning. So what we're realizing is math is not neutral, technology is not neutral, data is not neutral, and therefore artificial intelligence is not neutral. This is considered one of the foundational cases when we talk about bias in machines. And as a criminologist and criminal psychologist, and someone who has engaged the criminal justice system on many levels, working in the administrative side, a training of law enforcement, working with juveniles, doing criminal profiling, I have had the experience to work with these algorithms. And the criminal justice system has been using algorithms for decades, what we call risk assessment tools that really determine whether or not you are a threat to public safety. So these tools are used for sentencing, they are used for parole, they are used for risk, and they are used as a way to sort of track recidivism or reoffending, or decide who is going to be a threat to public safety, who is not going to be a threat, and usually presented or promised as something that is not going to create, that is not only going to deliver expediency, but is something that is going to present the service in the criminal justice system as some sort of excellence. But what we have seen with our historic data sets would be what I call this troublesome inheritance that continues to replicate itself. This study on machine bias and risk assessments in criminal sentencing was done by ProPublica. And at the bottom in red, you are seeing the risk scores, and you are seeing also documented the kinds of offenses that the individuals had on their arrest sheets. And what we're seeing is that when you look at the risks, you see young Miss Brescia Borden, who jumped on a scooter, took it a few streets passed her home and left it there, and it was reported as stolen. Her risk is seen as 8, and of course we have Robert on that side. So when you think about risk, you could just look at this and you could ask yourself the question, what is used to determine the kinds of risk? What is used to determine whether or not these individuals are going to get a particular sentence? And when we think about that, I just want you to think about this one. So this is Robert Williams and his wife and his children, and he was arrested in front of his wife and his children, what turned out to be a very traumatic experience. He is from Detroit. The police came to his home with photographs from facial recognition technology saying that he was seen. Of course, he was photographed. His image was captured in a mall, shoplifting expensive watches. Of course, he said he was not there. He said that was not he was not the individual. He was arrested. He was taken down to the police station. He stayed there for several hours, and of course, it took one officer who decided to compare his driver's license and the images, and the officer realized that Robert Williams was not their guy. Of course, his wife and his children experienced the trauma of the arrest. His job was also impacted, and Mr. Williams and his family have become sort of the test case when we talk about facial recognition for within the realm of social justice, and his life and his experience and the kind of intervention that was delivered to lift this family back up is really well documented by Dr. Joy Bullum-Reeney's Algorithmic Justice League, where she has worked with Mr. Williams and his family, and where Joy herself has been credited with making us understand the kinds of racial typologies that we continue to see in technology, she having to buy a white mask to put over her Black face for it to be recognized in an artistic project she was doing while working on her PhD at MIT. And of course, when we're thinking about perpetrating old stereotypes, we think a lot about algorithms being used in policing and law enforcement, of course, facial recognition, and asking ourselves, we have this ability to design this extraordinary technology called AI, this brilliant, almost new technology. Yes, it was not invented yesterday. It has a history about 50 years where it started at Dartmouth with about 6 scientists, but its approach, because of machine learning and deep learning and neural networks and the many things that we're seeing with data science, this technology is really a brilliant a new approach. And of course, what we're seeing is the perpetration, and it's continuously perpetuating old stereotypes. So when we talk about data trauma really leads to what is considered institutional betrayal. So many individuals who've had traumatic experiences because of their data really feel betrayed by many of the institutions that are supposed to work for us, like our criminal justice system or our child protection system or law enforcement or our banking system or anything to do with housing. So what we have seen with data would be questions around bias and discrimination and marginalization and profiling and victimization. And these approaches creating an extraordinary amount of trauma and really undermining the amount of public confidence and public trust that many institutions that are using data and deploying algorithmic decision-making systems or data-driven decision-making systems or automated decision-making systems, whichever they are called, or risk assessment tools, many individuals seeing that they are having critical challenges with the ways in which these technologies are being used. And why is that? Because many of our data points are proxies for discrimination. When we think about the ways educational history is used, or arrest records are used, or crime statistics are used, or zip codes are used, or our mother's maiden name is used. So what we're seeing with these technologies would be this resurrecting of some very dangerous racial hierarchies that come with that history. And we're seeing those desperate impacts and the revival of what I like to call discredited typologies, things that we removed through psychology and through social sciences and just through history, that we know that these are things we must not bring forward. So what do we do from the perspective of a data activist? What I like to think of us doing would be, how do we interrogate the data? And that's critical. And this is where we start to bring a critical data science approach to the ways in which we are thinking about data. So we know that data is never free of human judgment. We know all data not created equally. We know because it is seen as, it is perceived as math or statistics or just data, that there is this appearance of neutrality. And we know that has been debunked. One of the great books to debunk that is by Dr. Kathy O'Neill, and Kathy has been a visiting scholar at the School of Data Science. Her book is Weapons of Math Destruction, a great book. Also, Dr. Safia's Noble book, Algorithms of Oppression, Virginia Eubanks, Automating Inequality, just several books that are out there. Meredith Broussard, her book that looks at artificial unintelligence. And of course, Dr. Joy Billamrine's upcoming book, Unmasking AI. They speak about that appearance of neutrality and that presumption of objectivity. And what we do know is that memory of intergenerational trauma continues to move in those historic data sets. So what do we think about when we're thinking about critical data science, when we're thinking about how do we do data science with the kind of consciousness that's required, understanding things like social justice and design justice? Well, we have an extraordinary program. It's a summer program called the Data Justice Academy at the School of Data Science, and Dr. Claudia Schultz is the brainchild behind that fantastic program. And that program brings many young people to the School of Data Science in the summertime and gives them really an extraordinary space to start to think about social justice and design justice and just justice in general when we're talking about data science and using data science in ways that are equitable and ways that are just, and ways that are transparent and accountable. And at the School of Data Science, we also have some really great scholars who are working in this space. Dr. Jess Rea doing extraordinary work looking at night data and the impact of that. Even our dean of our Siri Russell and the kinds of thinking that she's bringing into the space about data equity. And just the entire approach of the School of Data Science, the ways in which we're thinking about ethics and the ways in which we're thinking about the kinds of values that we are offering our data science and the things that we are bringing to our program. And all of these are coming into a space where we're trying to bring more critical thinking. So we're talking about how do we, and I always say, how do I create this ethically aligned data pipeline? So we have got to think from an activist perspective, from a critical data science perspective, from an ethical data science perspective. We have got to think about collection. What's the history, the provenance of data? You know, who collected this data? How was it collected? Why was it collected? The analysis, who did the analysis? What was the social context, the political context? Was this funded by any particular agency? Questions around storage, visualization, presentation, sharing, reuse, even questions around disposal, even questions about the afterlife of data. What happens to our data after we die? Who's using that? What's being done with it? So when we think about data activism, really reimagining AI ethics, we're thinking of questions around democracy. Decision-making is a critical aspect of democracy. And if an algorithm has the ability to undermine your decision-making or undermine agency and autonomy, it means that an algorithm is something that you've got to think about. AI is something that you've got to think about critically, because what it's doing is really undermining that democratic process, what it means to be a full citizen. So when we talk about data and democracy, we have got to talk about due process. It is so very critical. What we're seeing with data activism is that ability to use data in a very powerful way and challenge the status quo. You know, don't build things the way that they were. Let's use data to build things better. Data to empower communities, data for policy change, of course, diversity, equity, inclusion, data that is trauma-informed, AI that is trauma-informed, AI and data that are justice-oriented. So we know that we have the ability to do some extraordinary things with data, some very positive and impactful work with data. We are seeing it, we are living it, and I am loving it, and I'm loving working in this space, because I say that, you know, I fell in love with data, working as a criminologist and really trying to go behind homicide statistics and really trying to understand what was creating violence and gun violence and why was homicide so high, and questions around legal cynicism and questions around justice and due process. So we're seeing how the data has the ability to create some very positive things, but there are also consequences. And these consequences are creating these new ethical challenges. Why is this? And I call it the data dilemma, because as powerful as data is also very, very vulnerable. And that's the big dilemma. Something that is so powerful and so impactful and could do such extraordinary things is so vulnerable to breaches and privacy challenges and hacking and just being used in ways that could be unethical or ways that could undermine legacies or destroy legacies or deny access and deny opportunities and deny resources. So what do we do? So this is just a photograph of me here in Montreal, I think, having a conversation with a big audience of individuals thinking about AI and thinking about doing AI ethically, and really speaking about ways in which we can audit algorithms for accountability. So when we think about AI ethics or data ethics, these are the things that we're thinking about. We're thinking always about doing no harm because there is no perfect data set. There's never going to be a perfect algorithm. But what we can begin is with this idea that the work that we are going to do is not going to harm. And if we are going to do work that is not going to harm, we've got to ensure through equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice that our work is unbiased and, of course, non-discriminatory. We've got to think about questions around safety and security. Those are the guardrails that we keep talking about that protect privacy, that protect our rights, that protect our identity, that protect our data. So we've got to think about fairness. And we've got to always ask ourselves, working in the space of data, working in the space of machine learning and data science, what is the mathematical formula? What is the statistical formula, the computational formula for fairness? What does that look like? And we have also got to think about questions around, are we being accountable? Are our processes accountable? The things that we are doing, are they transparent? Are they explainable? If an algorithm makes a decision about you, are you getting an explanation? Are the computer scientists and the data scientists and the technologists who are working in these new and emerging technologies like AI, generative AI, do they know why these algorithms are doing what they're doing? Now we're realizing is that many of them don't know, that algorithms may have a mind of their own, and algorithms are doing things that we never imagined. AI doing things that we've never imagined. One of the things we've also realized about AI is that we have tried to define it. And the only thing that we have come together to agree on is that AI does not at the moment really have a definition that, that we can truly go to market with. And we're realizing that many of these algorithms, you may have heard about hallucinations in generative AI, or just algorithms doing things in the financial sector, in the criminal justice system, creating these zombie predictions, overestimating the risks of Black and Brown communities. So we've got to always talk about questions around accuracy. And at the beginning, I spoke about precision decision making and using accurate data, quality data. All of these things are critical. And of course, the ability to audit. How do we audit? How do we do these vulnerability audits and these impact assessments on these algorithms that we're using, on these algorithmic decision-making systems or data-driven decision-making systems? So all of these are real-time questions around ethics. So what we bring for me is due diligence. And that is what data activism does in real time. It gives you a heightened level of due diligence, because what we want in data science would be high quality data sets. And if we are to get those high quality data sets, then we have got to bring a diligence into the space. And that diligence is only going to be crisp if we understand those historic questions, those social questions, those political questions, those economic questions. Many of them I touched upon earlier in this conversation. So how do we do that? We bring what is considered a human-centric approach to the ways in which we're thinking about data and AI and technology. So we've got to ensure in the things that we're doing, the things that we're building, designing, deploying, we are bringing a requisite level of human oversight. We're also understanding questions of safety and security and why these have got to be robust, these guardrails, these ethical guardrails. We've got to do some very rigorous work to ensure that our data sets are accurate. questions around documentation and traceability and data provenance, critical questions. And we're hearing more and more about this because of generative AI, because most people are unable now to detect if something is real, if something is fake, whether it's a deep fake, whether it's a real fake. People are just questioning and trying to get through the day, just thinking about AI in its myriad forms, or the ways in which we can engage with this technology, raising a lot of questions. And of course, always thinking about the user, thinking about the individual who has to use many of the products or the programs or the services that are being designed with data, and ensuring that there is no digital deception. They're ensuring that things are clear, things are adequate, things are understandable, people could comprehend what they're signing up for or what they're getting into. So duty of care is critical, because if we are creating things, and I always say as a data scientist or technologist, whether or not we're making products, whether or not we're designing systems and programs, or we're looking for solutions or using data to design policy, as a collective, we are designing futures. We're designing hybrid futures. And when we think about duty of care, from a data activist perspective, from an AI ethics perspective, we've got to think about questions around compliance and oversight and regulation and governance and enforcement. And you may have known that the EU AI Act is something that is being actively discussed, and something that will soon, or we hope will soon, become law. We know in the United States, it was just presented, this new act, the US AI Act, is something that has been fashioned or mirrored against the EU's AI Act. You may have heard about the GDPR, which I would say has been Europe's greatest contribution to technology, the General Data Protection Law, that really looks at ways in which we need to protect each other and protect big tech from doing things with our data as well, and ways in which we need to lift communities up, and we need to understand about the power of data, the things that data can do, and how we need to do those things in a way that we are accountable, and ways in which are transparent. In the US, we also have the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights, something that you should read, something that many companies at the moment are using to formulate their own sort of frameworks. And of course, we have so many government agencies and so many nonprofits and just companies trying to come into the data activism and the data ethics and AI ethics space to do what is right, and to bring high levels of duty of care into the space, and an understanding of the kinds of social responsibility that we have as individuals, building and innovating and imagining with data. And of course, AI, due process, I mentioned earlier, very critical, because data is about justice and data is about equity. And when we're speaking about justice and equity, we're also speaking about due process. We've come to realize through data activism and AI ethics that anything that has an ability to make a decision about you has the ability to undermine your civil rights, your human rights. You've got to think about just data rights. And we're realizing that data rights have turned into a very big civil rights battle. And you have the right to know when data is being used. You have the right to know when an algorithm is being used. You have a right to know if a decision has been made about you. And you also have the ability to remain unknown if you want to do that as well, or if you decide to opt out of something or just be anonymous. Those are rights that you have. So questions around data justice and questions around algorithmic justice, these are all linked to due process. So if we want to do data right and we want to do AI responsibly, I think we've got to ensure we are building an ethical culture at our organizations. This is so very critical. I think with the School of Data Science, with our big data ethics program, with the ways in which we are thinking about data science, the ways in which we've been hiring professionals at the School of Data Science, it's just, for me, a really brilliant approach to ensuring that what we do is really create generations upon generations, not only of ethical data scientists, but data scientists who are going to be leading in the data science space and who understand those ethical guardrails, who understand why that ethical culture is so important, and who understand what it is to be ethically resilient, understanding there's no perfect data set, there will be no perfect algorithm, but you've got to be resilient in the ways in which you are thinking about building technology, the ways in which you are thinking about designing and deploying algorithms, and just ways in which we need to think about those long-term impacts of data on society. And of course, something that I always speak about, which is ethical vigilance. And I think what data activism does, it makes us more ethically vigilant. So we're constantly thinking about impacts. We're constantly thinking about communities. We're constantly thinking about what are those long-term implications. So we want to do all those amazing things that we are doing, but we want to ensure that we're not destroying legacies. We want to ensure that we're not denying particular groups. We want to ensure that the things that we are doing with data, and I come back to the first statement that I made, there is no AI without data. And if we are to get data science right, if we are to get AI right, and I think we're doing that, is that we have got to come with that understanding that we're all data activists, because all our data are involved in this historic moment. And what we are searching for with AI that we can certainly get through data activism would be responsible AI, trustworthy AI, algorithmic accountability, very important, algorithmic auditability. Those questions about what is our algorithmic legacy going to look like. I always say we are at a time in history where even our dreams have become datafied. And one of the things that we don't want to do is we don't want to ever use technology or data or an algorithm to defer a dream. What we want to do is use this technology to really ensure that individuals and communities just have an equitable chance of achieving these extraordinary things that they can achieve with the data. And this is where I end, and this is where I want to thank you for listening to me. And I hope you've had something to think about, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Renee. So we have gotten a couple of questions. One of them is about, where do you think data activists are needed? Nonprofits, tech companies, academia? Are there roles outside of, quote, the traditional data science fields where you think that people would be really helpful in kind of combating, data activism and ethical AI?
Well, I would say needed everywhere. If I had the opportunity and the resources, I would have one at every street corner, having this conversation at every kitchen table, because we're all using data. All our data is involved. We know that when we think about AI, when we think about data, when we think about rights, when we think about responsibilities, when we think about risks, when we think about the law, the law is always way behind the technology itself. So data activism just has to be a part of our consciousness, just as we understand our human rights and we understand our civil rights and we understand the kinds of rights that we have. We need to start understanding our data rights. So I will say, I would put them on every street corner. I would have them just everywhere, just waving that data activist flag and having those conversations, because our data is something that we cannot see. And it's being used in extraordinary ways, and it's being used in ways that could be weaponized against us. And we've just got to be there. We're all standing on the front line of this movement.
You mentioned, given that technology is so far ahead of where the data, the technology is evolving every day, and how can these issues be reeled in? What can we do now with the data that we're collecting to to try to kind of meet up where the technology is constantly, evolving?
So I think what we've got to do is bring this kind of understanding and bring this requisite level of consciousness that understands how politics, how sociology, just about every discipline intersects with data. And I think we've got to bring what I call this interdisciplinary imagination that is so required to ensure that we get the best out of data. And if we are to get the best out of data, then I believe we're going to get the best out of AI. But if we continue to bring a lazy approach, if we continue to be lethargic in the ways in which we are thinking, and we continue to over rely on those historic data sets, then we're undermining our own creativity. we're undermining our own brilliance. We're undermining what it means to innovate, because you really want to innovate in a way that is inclusive, a way that is diverse, and a way that really excites and captures the imagination. You don't want to innovate just for some. You want to innovate for all.
So we have a question from one of our, some companies using AI do not collect demographic information, making detecting bias in their models not directly testable. What are your thoughts on this? Are there methods for detecting this bias even without that information?
I think there are. And I think what we've seen is that many of the companies who've tried that approach and who've tried to build products on it still find themselves in some of the in a very precarious place when it comes to just this really dubious ways in which data could be biased. One of the things that we have heard is that many companies looking at ways in which they can create algorithms to debias other algorithms. And we're seeing that this thing is just much deeper than the data. And we have got to drill pretty deep into it. And the more we drill, we're realizing that so much of this comes with a thinking, comes with a mindset, come with things that are so deep in the psyche that often we don't know. So many of our designers, our developers, our technicians, our technologists, persons working in the space have really got to get that critical data science consciousness and understand what we're doing at this moment is pretty big, and we've got to do it right.
One of the questions that came in actually through our open when we were collecting registration is, how might corporate organizations measure progress or impact risk mitigation related to AI ethics and data activism? Like, how are these corporations going to measure that they're making progress, to kind of counteract the bias in the data?
Well, this is one of the reasons we speak about these impact assessments and vulnerability audits, and the fact that companies and organizations and agencies and academia, anywhere an algorithm is being used, have got to understand that they need to run those impact assessments. I think a few months ago, the 2023 version of the Algorithmic Accountability Act was reintroduced on the Capitol, and we've got to really think about accountability. If we're talking accountability, we're speaking accuracy. If we're speaking accuracy, we're speaking auditability. So you've got to be able to audit. How are companies measuring that? Well, first of all, you could measure it whether or not your company has found itself in a crisis, whether or not your company has any kind of litigation against you, whether or not your company has been involved in any kind of media attack, whether you've been dragged over social media because of something that you've created. Many companies are only able to measure at the end, when there is a crisis, when they've created something that is creating extraordinary risk. So more companies need to be proactive. More companies need to understand that they need to hire ethical data scientists, AI ethicists, individuals who understand those critical questions around data, individuals who are coming with that data activism philosophy, individuals who are understanding the high stakes that we're playing with at this moment as we are innovating with data.
So another question that came in
Sure.
Before is, there's been some recent court decisions at the Supreme Court level where that have raised some concerns around privacy and the way data brokerages, social media information is collected and may be used. Do you think that this creates kind of a new opening to address some of these issues, like on a constitutional level, that there may be some instances for kind of law enforcement to use data in some ways in people's personal lives?
Well, more than law enforcement, we talk data, we talk democracy, we talk decision making, we spoke about due process. And we're talking about questions around equity. I think generative AI in general has brought up questions around intellectual property and copyright, and who has access, who has the ability to use, and who has the ability to reuse. And we're seeing more and more of these kinds of decisions. Now, I will say this to you. AI and generative AI has the extraordinary potential, if used ethically, to really reimagine the judiciary and reimagine criminal justice and reimagine just the ways in which we do rehabilitation and reentry and all those things that we have not been able to do well on the legal side. Generative AI and AI just has the extraordinary ability to really rearrange the methodology of the law when you think about legal AI, and that's something I'm very interested in. But we've also got to think about the impacts on people, on people's rights. We've got to think about the impacts in particular on creatives, because individuals who are working in creative spaces are really feeling the impact of these technologies being able to really take away the ways in which they have historically earned an income. So there are lots of things that are emanating from the black box. And we have got to think about those things critically, because what we want to do with this technology is we want to increase, of course, the ways in which we're innovating and the speed at which we're innovating and the great things that we can do. Particularly, I'm always fascinated by medical AI and healthcare AI and precision healthcare and all those great things that promises us that we're going to stay young forever, all of those fantastic things. But we've got to think about people. And if we're thinking about people, we have got to think about those long-term impacts, and we've got to think about legacies. And we've got to ensure that we're not using this technology to destroy legacies.
One of the other questions, kind of, general kind of questions is kind of like, what can the everyday person do in their day-to-day lives to kind of, address it in their day-to-day lives about, having, data, ethical data practices in their everyday life?
Sure. So I will say, be aware, try to educate yourself as much as you can, and also be informed. It's about AI literacy. It's also about just questions around data literacy. And it's also about this understanding of the power of your data and understanding the power of your click, or the power of an emoji, or the power of the things you share on Instagram and Snapchat and LinkedIn and all the other things that were other names that are now new names. All those social media platforms, and understanding what you are doing with your data. And I will just say, be informed, be aware, and just be on top of it. We all enjoy using our various platforms, but just think a little more. Just think a little more about what you're doing with your data.
Are there areas that you think that AI has the opportunity to be a force in addressing the past racial injustices you so eloquently discussed?
Oh, well, thank you so very much for that question. I will say, of course, there are things that I have been thinking about, ways in which we could use AI and generative AI and virtual reality to reimagine the ways in which we are doing criminal justice, to bring a more innovative approach to therapeutic jurisprudence and questions around reentry and rehabilitation and recidivism. Of course, the ways in which we're thinking about housing and real estate and finance and credit. And I always say, how do we code risk? How do we code risk? And risk is something that we're trying to use algorithms. I spoke about hindsight and foresight and insight and oversight. It's all about risk and ways in which we want to mitigate these risks. And we have just got to understand that those historic data sets could be very problematic. Oftentimes, we need to use them, and we've just got to be aware. It's about awareness. It's about awareness. Awareness is critical to consciousness. And if you have awareness and if you have the kind of consciousness, then I think you have the ability to really innovate in a really interdisciplinary way that could be absolutely brilliant. But if you're going in there with a very myopic perspective, or you're going in there existing in some sort of data vacuum, or you're going in there with these historic data sets, and you're just bringing a really lethargic approach to the ways in which you're thinking, then we're going to create some problems.
Kind of looking towards the future generations. I know that you've had some involvement with some high school programs in North Carolina, I believe. Can you just talk a little bit more about, what high school, what you see in kind of the lower grades at these fantastic schools and their teachers are doing in their classrooms, so that students can consider this as a field, but also as they grow up in a more, technology advanced world?
Most definitely. I will say I have spent a lot of time with high school students and at a lot of high schools, even right here in Charlottesville, St. Anne's Belfield, and the principal of that school, who I think I have a wonderful relationship with, and she really had myself and some other individuals in the space having this conversation with her student body and having this conversation with students. And I will say this, and I am proud to say that students are thinking about data rights and they're thinking about algorithmic rights. And I think many of our students are understanding why we've got to bring an equitable perspective, why we've got to bring a requisite level of visibility to individuals who are not in this space. When we think about questions around accessibility and disability, and designing things that are more accessible and designing things that are really creating space for individuals who do not feel seen to participate. So questions around voice and visibility and representation. These questions are huge for young people. And I am so proud that they are understanding the power of inclusivity and they are understanding the power of equity. So I think at the high school level, there are also some brilliant programs. There are also some amazing nonprofits that are working in this space who are bringing that kind of thinking, who are bringing, those conversations about ethical data science and ethical AI into the schools. And I think we're going to be okay.
And so we have time for one last question. Building a diverse AI workforce is critical to these problems. And so the audience has asked if there's any organizations that you think are doing a really great job around this. I know that you just mentioned that there's some great nonprofits. Would you mind just, naming some so that, our audience can continue on their, their learning journey?
I will name one, and then actually, for full transparency, I am also their inaugural data, AI, and policy fellow, and that's All Tech is Human. And All Tech is Human is a brilliant nonprofit that has really captured the imagination of AI and data ethics. They continue to bring together such an extraordinary group of scholars in the AI ethics space, in the data science space, in the democracy space, in healthcare, just about every corner of academia coming together with industry, coming together to really have those critical conversations. You can follow them in any social media space. And I think they are doing the kind of work that is needed at this most critical moment in history.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
This was, I mean, I know I learned a lot from this conversation, and I am sure our audience will. So thank you so much for spending this hour with us and allowing us to learn and contemplate, the way that data impacts our lives and everything like that. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. We will send a follow-up note where we'll highlight some of the fantastic things that Renée has mentioned during this presentation, and also a link to the recording. But thank you all so much and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.